3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff.
Welcome to Donuts and Bikes, the mountain bike coaching podcast. Your hosts are Kristian Jackson and me, Paul Howard, and we're here to discuss the skills, techniques, and tactics we've used over the last 20 years to progress our riders and coaches to become more skillful and confident, and ultimately have more fun on bikes. So click into a harder gear and get ready to dig deep into some of these skills. Hey, Kristian, how's it going?
Hey, good, Paul. Good to see you. Excited to be back on the mic here.
Yeah, back for another episode. Let's jump in with some highlights from last week's or a couple of weeks ago, the Drops episode. Any thoughts or takeaways from you from that Drops episode? Part one. We'll do another one down the road.
Yeah, part one of Drops. A couple things that really stuck out to me when thinking back through it was your comment about how we should feel as coaches when we're teaching drops, and you mentioned this idea of, the feeling at ease basically was if somebody's going to go, if you're coaching someone to go off a large drop, just as you would be coaching in a field. And I really took that to heart and think that that's a really important idea for our coaches to think about there in terms of how do we set up our lessons in terms of managing the risk, managing the safety, progressing the learning in a way that makes everybody comfortable. So that was a big highlight for me with that one. And then the second piece there was teaching drops is really teaching skills, right?
Yeah.
So we're training skills, and as opposed to just simply riding our bike teaching her how to ride a bike off a wood drop or rock drop.
Yeah, it's they're the pieces, they're the components that are ultimately going to help the rider move better or get the timing right or get the technique right. And yeah, I like that. At the end of the day, it's all skill-based teaching, really.
Right. Did you have any highlights from the episode?
I mean, mine were fairly similar, but as you were talking, I did think of I don't know where it came from. It just popped in my head, but like, if you have the butterflies, no one should fly. Like,
nice. Yeah.
That's it. Like, yeah, nobody should be getting their wheels off the ground. If any of you, especially the coach, has butterflies. So maybe people can remember that catchphrase. Catchphrase? Yeah, let's call it
catchphrase. Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
All right. Today we have on the menu manuals. So I think a nice way to start today's episode is for our listeners. Our challenge is can you learn how to manual from a podcast, which kind of sounds a bit silly for sure, but I think it's a cool challenge, and we'll see what we can do. We'll go through some concepts, some ideas, some techniques to hopefully either introduce people to manuals, and if you're already doing a manual, maybe we can get you doing a manual for longer or further down the road. But let's dig in with just some of the first steps. First things first. So manuals is often a label that's applied to a trick, and then when you ask people what a manual is, sometimes they'll come up with pretty different answers based on their background or experience. So maybe one good place to start is just let's sort of break it down and figure out or define more clearly. For today's podcast, Kristian, like, what would you say the definition of a manual is?
I like to think about a manual as a maneuver in which the front wheel is being maintained off the ground and the rider is standing on their pedals. So they're not seated, they're standing, and they're using the momentum generated from pedaling or coasting to maintain the wheel in the air. As I think it's helpful to contrast this with a wheelie, in which, wheelie, typically we're seated and we're initiating this through pedaling, maintaining it through pedaling. And so I think that's the initiation, how we initiate these things is dramatically different from one to the other.
Yeah, for sure. I think standing up and not pedaling is they're two sort of very obvious things to list off the top with what are we doing when we're manual. I think the other one is also the style of manual. Like I think a lot of people, when you say the word manual, that they might think more of kind of a BMX style or maybe a Win Masters, Wheelie Wednesdays, and they're kind of manualing
indefinitely.
Yeah, indefinitely. The whole length of a pump track. So for today, we're really just, I admit I've always kind of coined the two terms BMX manuals, where the rider's got the front wheel up and they're balancing on that balance point for a really long time. And it looks sick. I mean, I would say that's the ideal version of the trick or the maneuver that we're aiming for eventually, is those super steezy manuals. And then the real version of the trick is what I call a puddle manual, which for me or any of you growing up in the UK or anywhere cold and wet, I grew up in the UK and I learned to manual initially out of a need to stop getting wet and stop getting cold feet in the winters. It was just a way to stay warmer and drier, and obviously get wetter and wetter and you get bigger and bigger puddles, then naturally you start wanting to learn how to manual for further distances. So for me, it all started off with puddles. So I think for today, we'll probably stick more towards the puddle version of a manual, where you might have the front wheel in the air for, maybe 2, 3, 4 bike lengths, is a nice way of looking at it. And right now we're not trying to, at least initially, we're not trying to talk about this classic kind of BMX manual where we're keeping the front wheel up forever. So that's what we're going to aim for today is how can we do, or how can we learn one of those puddle manuals. Any anecdotes about, teaching or learning manuals from your experiences, Kristian? I know you happen to be pretty nifty with these yourself. Any kind of experiences you want to share with our listeners before we maybe jump into some of the technical side of things?
For sure. I think that one of the goals for this podcast is to really highlight the difference between the puddle manual, the BMX manual, and to really kind of set expectations and setting goals, and the importance of that for riders and for coaches. And typically that the puddle manual is relatively quick to learn. The BMX manual is a much longer process. And I was reminded, kind of thinking through getting ready for this podcast, of the beginning of the pandemic here in the States. One of the things that we could do was go ride our bikes. Yeah. And our park, Rocky Knob Park here in Boone, has a quite large asphalt parking lot. That's relatively level, got a bit of a grade on one end of it. And we found ourselves riding with me and my 2 boys and their friends and their friends' dads. And we would from the very beginning of the pandemic, we would go ride trails and then spend probably an hour or more in the parking lot working on tricks. And at the beginning, none of the boys could wheelie or could manual.
Yeah.
And, they were, this a few years ago now, but couldn't do it. And so we kind of, without really doing a lot of instruction, just started, I kind of started role modeling, just kind of showing wheelies, started with wheelies and then worked into manuals. And then over the course of that year, so started, March 2020, by the end of that year, they were manualing most of the length of the parking lot. So several football fields.
That's cool.
And there was a long process, and it was, a lot of minute practicing of it, which we'll get around to it. And then I think just in going through that experience with them holistically for months at a time, just kind of watching that really helped me as a coach kind of think about, my own strategy and techniques for how to teach this, how to coach it. And that's something we'll talk about later, with the kind of the distinction between teaching and coaching.
Yeah. No, I love that. And that reminds me a little bit of my process when, when I grew up in the UK, and I was talking earlier about puddles for sure, but mostly where I learned to manual as a kid / young adult was when I was working in bike shops, and there was about a 20-minute ride into town and back every day along the London road, and just endless pavement and so many rows to kind of manual between. So, and I used to do it on my paper round in the mornings as well. And I think back to that, and I kind of think, how many hours did I spend either on my paper round or riding in and out of work to the bike shop every day? And like, how many roads did I try and manual across before the front wheel dipped, before the curb on the other side? And that always got my heart going if you mistimed that or you dropped the front wheel too early. And then thankfully they started making pavements where the curbs were accessible for wheelchairs. So if you dropped the front wheel too early, you didn't die. But there was a bunch of pavements and curbs that didn't have that wheelchair access ramp. But yeah, I mean, I'm waffling on, but long story short, I think back to that and I think, yeah, that we always talk about the 10,000 hours, right? And I'm sure it was pretty close to that. And I didn't even realize I was doing it. It was just a way for me to have fun on my bike in my morning commute. And if our listeners take anything away from that, it's like these harder skills of wheelies, manuals, bunny hops, if you're playing on your bike all the time when you're riding into work or riding to the trails or waiting for people in the car park, that's where you can squeeze in those 10,000 hours. Spread that out over a couple of years and you'll get there. Everyone finds manuals so hard when they start. It's kind of like when you start going to the gym, it sucks, you hate it, and half the time you give up because you're like, this sucks. You don't see the returns immediately and you give up and you go home. And I think manuals are the same, but stick to it and put in the hours. And I've never seen someone not learn to manual that hasn't put in the hours. Put it that way.
Exactly. And we'll talk about this a little bit later this episode of the practice part and what it is that we're practicing.
Yeah.
With the manual.
Nice.
But Paul, before we get into that, how about we start off with some conceptual stuff first, just to kind of chat a little bit about.
Sounds good.
Some theories that might be helpful for our coaches and our riders who are interested in manuals. I thought the first place we start, kind of where we start all the time, is our position. We talk about stability and balance as two sides of the same coin in terms of position. What we talk about stability, what does stability mean for you as a rider in this case?
Stability is, for me, it's just feeling strong. Like if I'm on the bike or you're standing on your skis or whatever stance or position you have, it's like when I used to play tennis, like I'd always stand in a really stable position to when you're receiving a serve, like wide feet, low stance, you feel in a powerful, strong position, and you feel like you can move if you want to, you can push if you want to. If something pushed you or something pushed you, it wouldn't push you over, it wouldn't cause you to lose your balance. Stability is just that sense of like, do I feel solid? Do I feel strong? Not stiff, not kind of stuck, but just I'm strong and capable.
Cool. And what about some words for balance and how that differs from stability?
Balance. Balance. I love this word balance because it kind of depends if you use the adjective or the noun. But essentially, I like to break it down between, the goal is to feel balanced. So if I'm balanced, I'm not doing too much balancing. So those two words just help me kind of paint a more clear picture on what are we discussing. So, if you have 2 feet wide apart, you've got a pretty athletic, stable stance. Chances are you're going to feel balanced, right? Like there's not a lot of correction, wobbling. There's not a lot of balancing going on. So you're balanced. But then if you sort of stand on one leg and then there's a wind blowing or something, then all of a sudden you're going to feel yourself, oh, I'm balancing. I'm trying to not fall over. So balancing is managing instability. You've lost that strong strength. You've lost that strong position, and you're trying to deal with that. Classic example is like slacklining. You're on this tiny little kind of base of support. The base of support keeps moving as well because the rope isn't fixed or the slack line's not fixed. So you're constantly fighting instability, and so it requires a lot of balancing skills. And very rarely do you stand on well, depends how good you are. If you're rubbish like me, I'm not ever going to be on a slack line and feel balanced, right? I'm only going to feel balanced when I'm back on the ground again with a pina colada in my hands. But I'm not going to feel balanced ever for me on a slack line. I'm sure someone who's really good at it might, but so that's kind of how I look at those two things. Stability is feeling strong, good stable position, and then balance or balancing is managing that instability if we happen to lose it. So classic example on the bike, 2 wheels on the ground, you're going to feel more stable. The bike will feel more stable. As soon as the front wheel's in the air, your base of support is obviously now tiny. It's just the size of the rear contact patch of the rear wheel. So you got this tiny base of support. It's kind of like you've gone from standing on the steps to suddenly, standing on that slack line, and now the front wheel's in the air, and now you're having to manage that instability, and that's where this balancing kicks in.
Awesome. I didn't know we were going into a grammar session today, but yeah. I love it. That idea of the noun versus the adjective with balance it's really useful actually to think about being balanced as a result.
Exactly.
And balancing is the action.
Yeah.
Right. The movement to regain that stability. I think that's a useful way to think about it. And I think where we're going with this with manuals is that we're more towards the balance end.
Yes.
Of this idea. And in terms of skill development, we think about like how we as individuals learn skills. Think about this idea of riders that are new to riding really focusing on their stability, trying to make them feel strong. Right. And so we have lessons are designed around position with feeling strong and centered.
Yeah.
Being centered, their center of mass over base of support, one of the rules of stability, keeping everything in line in this way. And then at some point, once a rider is consistent with being able to manage being centered most of the time, we start to explore range of movement. And we start to see that it's not always advantageous to be centered all the time. How can we use movement to do other things on the bike? And I think what's important for our listeners to be thinking about is that, once we start talking about range of movement concepts like the manual, it's really imperative to have that sense of centeredness first.
Yeah.
Right. And what it means to be stable, what it means to be strong. And you have to have some mileage around this before we can explore the range of movement.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. Like, I feel like as a coach, if you've got like beginner, novice, intermediate rider, so much of that coaching is positioning and trying to feel more centered, stronger on the bike, feel that stability, and then trying to maintain that a good stable position when things are happening, like braking or compressions or forces from the trail. And then you go up from like strong, intermediate, and above, and the needle almost swings the other way. It's like the position's pretty good, but now the problem is they don't move. They've kind of found their happy place. They like where they are on top of the bike. They like where the bike is underneath them, and now they don't almost want to let it go. So it's almost like, I kind of think of it like the first thing is you've got to kind of build the little action figure. But then the second stage is like, now you've got to melt him a little bit, loosen him up, because it's like he's kind of like rigid plastic, but then you need to sort of put him in the microwave for 20 seconds and get the plastic to melt a little bit. So now he can actually move and you can actually play with it. And I think of like that for us as riders is we get good at being centered and stable, and then we don't ever want to move because we found that happy place. So yeah, I would say that's
comfort zone. Yeah, it's
the comfort zone. Yeah. And then when we get into teaching range and movement and balance, it's often a little unnerving because they're so used to, like, with stem being centered, weight the wheels evenly, and now we're kind of telling them almost the opposite. Like, let's see what it's like to corner slightly forward, to corner slightly back, or try a manual and be as far back or as far forward as we can. And yeah, it's a cool part of that learning process. And when a student starts getting into that range of movement coaching, it's amazing how many doors it opens up for their riding.
Final conceptual point here before we move into the manual for our coaches listening. This idea of skill development and where the rider is in their skill development dictates a bit of how we approach teaching and coaching. And so when we think about teaching stability, introducing basic range of movement, typically we're operating in a teaching mode, where the coach is doing a lot of the talking, a lot of the presenting, a lot of the demos, and giving a lot of feedback. And as the rider progresses in their competency of whatever skill we're working on, then we kind of transition into more of a coaching mode where we're talking less and we're watching more, and we're giving pointers, and we're ultimately trying to get our riders to be autonomous in what they're doing. And I think it's really important to put the learning of the manual into the context of, at the beginning, we're going to be probably doing a lot of teaching.
Yeah. And
then longer term, like in my example with, months and months of this, there might be times when you're really not, you're coaching and you're not talking at all. You're maybe just demoing, giving very, very brief feedback or encouragement. Do that again. Try that again.
Yeah, totally. Like, for me, sometimes I talk about it with riders and coaches that, like, if the rider needs information, there's missing information, I'll be more instructional. I'll be teaching more like, well, let's upload some data onto their hard drive, because they don't quite cognitively understand what they're trying to do with their body or the bike. But as soon as they that data's uploaded to the hard drive, so to speak, and they know what they're trying to do and they know why, they also might know what they're trying to not do and why, then that's where I start to flip into a little bit more of that coaching mode, like you said, where as a coach and I'm watching my students, if I see them execute it unsuccessfully, straight away I understand it's not because they don't know what they're trying to do. It's just because they haven't got the mileage yet. And that's where a lot of instructors will get stuck. They'll fall into that trap of like, oh, my student hasn't performed that manual successfully yet, so I'll keep talking, I'll keep demoing, I'll keep teaching a kind of classic instructor style. But the good coach will understand that, like, no, it's not because they're missing information, they just simply don't have the mileage. So my role now changes. It's not to jump in and talk, it's to help with the terrain, help with the encouragement, help with the physical component, like give them a break, let's have some water, let's go back to it, focus on quality movements, not quantity movements. And that's where that coaching starts to rise to the top, so to speak.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the podcast. If you want to learn more about us, please check out our first info episode, which digs into who we are, what we do, and our background in the coaching and mountain bike industry. You can also check us out on Instagram at Donuts and Bikes, or our podcast website is the mountainbikecoachingpodcast.buzzsprout.com. All right, back to the show.
I like to think about, with anytime we're teaching something new, what are the prerequisites before we do this? And for this one, I think it really comes down to making sure that our riders do have some range of movement, because we're going to be, getting into some more dramatic range of movements with this manual, so that we're seeing that. Also with this one, I like to know that there's some good braking habits established with the rider. I think for this, the puddle manual, we could probably start there. What sorts of terrain choice do you like to use in terms of the puddle manual for teaching?
The shorter manuals, a lot of people might go towards, say, grass, and grass is good because it's obviously lower consequence if they do happen to make a mistake and fall off. But for me, like if I go to those prerequisites and I can see they can do pedaling wheel lifts, maybe a small wheelie, they have real clear range of movement skills, confident with their braking. They can react quickly with their braking. That's the other one. Like, can they apply the brakes quickly when it was unexpected? If I've done my research, spent some time with a rider, warmed them up gradually, then my terrain choice can be impacted from that. So, for example, if I'm not sure because I haven't seen them do wheelies or haven't looked at their braking or their range of movement, I'm going to be uber cautious and I'll probably put them on grass. Pros are, like we said, if they make a mistake, it's softer. Cons are, it's really tiring learning to manual on grass because it's just drags, it's too slow. Ideally, you want to be learning to even just do a short kind of 1 or 2 bike lengths kind of puddle style manual on just, a dirt road, empty car park is ideal. Maybe a really quiet valley trail if no one's around, because it just makes it more efficient, and learning to manuals is tiring. So if you can find terrain that's safe, has good grip, it's flat, it's smooth, and you've done the prerequisites and the warm-ups with their braking, then you don't necessarily have to jump straight to grass. And ideally a bit of gradient. Flat's always good, but if there's a slight downslope, or ideally maybe just both, if you have an area where there's a bit of a bank somewhere, a bit of a gradient somewhere, and then a bit of a flat zone, usually we start flat and then we'll graduate up to just a very gentle downslope. Yeah, that's probably a good place to start.
For sure. I mentioned the parking lot. I think it's worth noting that when practicing this and working with students, it's pretty easy to get tunnel vision into the doing and maybe lose track of what the surroundings are. So picking some place that's very low traffic, isolated from vehicles and other riders and such as well. Paul, I've seen you lead some stretching before manuals.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that for a minute?
That's just because I'm old and I need to stretch. No,
a while back. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even for riders of all ages, riders of all kind of physiques, different backgrounds, manuals are very tough on shoulders, necks, hips, lower back. If you went into the gym and anyone, any age, and suddenly someone just told you like, all right, no warm up, just do 50 chin-ups now or 10 deadlifts or whatever, you'd risk hurting yourself. And manuals are very explosive, and if you're not used to it, you can hurt your shoulder, you can hurt your neck. So again, a good coach is aware of all the things that will affect someone's performance, not just their technique. So yeah, I'll always try and set up with a bit of a warm-up with, like we said, the kind of the wheelies and maybe some hops, some endos. That's my skill assessment. I've got my little terrain choice. Then we'll do a bit of a stretching session and warm-up session, a bit of a yoga session. So stretching the hips for sure, stretching the lower back, the quads, the hamstrings, shoulders and neck. And usually these days, everyone's fairly clued up with that kind of stuff. So it doesn't take long to sort of just take 10, 15 minutes and make sure you're warmed up before you jump on that bike and start trying to get steezy.
Cool. Very cool. Hey, in terms of bikes and bike setup, I like to make sure that flat pedals are a starting point.
For sure, yeah.
And that, we've obviously checked everything, but I like to have my full suspension bike, the shock open.
Yeah.
And just because that's more realistic if you're coasting, if you're riding, your shock is probably open. So there's sometimes maybe some debate about that, but I think it's worthwhile to have it open while you're learning to do this.
Yeah, it just helps the back end sink down, which is obviously going to help your balance point. You want to set up the bike. The other one is I'm pretty anal with just people's brakes. So I really check their bike points, their pad wear. Again, these days, everyone's got pretty sweet brakes. I mean, it's ridiculous. Like I learned on a manual on a BMX. The brakes are so bad. I used to pour Coca-Cola over the brake pads and it would last for like one ride into town.
Yeah.
So I learned a manual on a bike that basically didn't really have a back brake. But kids these days, they don't know how lucky they are.
Right. Sink or swim.
Yeah.
And then, last piece on bikes is the saddle height needs to be as low as possible.
Yeah. It goes without saying. You can try it with a seat up, but you're not gonna have a good time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's talk through the parts of the actual doing of the manual. You want to take the first part?
Yeah, that's cool. I could do part one and you could jump in part two or something. Okay. But so for the mini manual or the puddle manual, I always warm up myself actually sometimes and my students with just neutral, poke, buzz. Basically just imagine yourself rolling along the ground, nice tall neutral position, chin over stem. And you're just going to flex your knees, sink down. And as you're sinking down, you're going to use your arms to poke and your heels, your feet to poke the bike ahead. And the buzz component comes where if you do it enough and you poke the bike ahead, you bend your knees, you should be able to buzz your butt on the back tire. So make sure you're wearing some shorts and you're not just coming out of the lake skinny dipping. So make sure you've got some good shorts or a pair of pants and buzz the butt on the back tire. And it sounds a bit funny, but the reason we do it is you're not trying to lift the front wheel. This is purely a range of movement exercise. So start neutral, sink down, poke the bike ahead, buzz your butt on the rear wheel. And what that's teaching you is the range of movement that you need to do a manual. And usually people don't have enough range of movement. So that's just a very simple exercise that will just straight away start building and stretching people's range of movement. Because a lot of time when you're manualing, your butt is maybe, depending on the manual, depending on the bike, it could be 2-3 inches off the top of the rear wheel. So it's pretty close to that rear wheel. So more than anything, it's just a warm-up exercise, number one. And number two, it's a great way just to start getting that range of movement going. And also, I guess one point to add is you should feel like as you're poking the bike ahead and bending your knees down towards the rear tire, it's more the bike going ahead rather than you leaning back. And that's important because the bike is very light and easy to move relative to sort of the big heavy mass of the rider. And a good manual will have an explosive movement of the bike sort of scooching ahead from underneath you rather than the rider doing sort of a big gross movement where they sort of throw their hips back over the body. it looks very similar, and biomechanically it is very similar. But from a practical application sense on the trail, like a good manual, you can do them quickly, and you can do them quickly if you can explode the bike ahead rather than sort of thinking about moving your weight back. That's part one: neutral, poke, buzz, and wear some good shorts.
Right. No, not straight from skinny dipping.
Yeah.
I like this idea of the poke. It's something I try to ingrain in the rider is as they're practicing that movement, the neutral, buzz, poke, that they're thinking about the poke. Actually, the bike is moving, and it's not the rider moving for the reasons that you talked about. But like to mentally be thinking along those lines and conscious of like that's what they're doing. And you'll sometimes see the front wheel getting light at this point, when they're practicing this. You kind of highlight that that's part of what's happening here is that front wheel is getting light.
Well, and it's also gently introducing them to the balancing, right? Because as you move the bike ahead, you're clearly now putting a lot of weight over the rear axle, the rear tire. That's less stable. And so it's just, without lifting the front wheel in the air, without manualing, they're starting to feel what it's like to be balancing on that slack line. That stability is being compromised. And now they have to bring in those balancing skills to ride away and stay upright. So without jumping straight into the manual, it's helping them feel and learn some of the essential skills of a manual without actually having to do a manual. So it's a good little progression.
Right. Cool. Part two with the pedal manual is kind of the initiation phase. We call this the squash and scooch and the bend and cover. And the squash and scooch is critical to initiate the wheel coming off the ground. And so from a neutral position, we're squashing the pedals and we're scooching the bike ahead of us by dropping the heels. So it's one motion where we're squashing those pedals. You can feel it load the suspension, and dropping the heels pushes the feet forward with that scooch, and the front wheel is going to come up. Yeah. Right. So this is the initiation. This is how it differs from the wheelie. If you were to compare the two, we're squashing, scooching, initiating with the feet, and again, we're pushing the bike ahead of us as opposed to simply leaning back or pulling back, right? Or moving back, and then so we'll practice that in and of itself, that movement in and of itself, until it becomes a routine piece of this. We're able to connect the downward squash and the forward scooch into one motion, through that.
Yeah, I kind of think of it like, because a lot of the time people will squash the rear, like squash the bike, so the suspension will compress, and they'll almost let it unweight, and so the suspension extends again.
Yeah. And
then they try and scooch the bike ahead with their feet or dropping the heel and pushing the bike ahead. So that's a really common one. And they don't quite realize they're doing it. It's almost like a squash, unweight, and then they drop their hips back. So it's really important that it's a squash and scooch together. Like they squash the rear suspension if they have it. If they don't have it, just squash. Think about squashing the rear tire. Drop the heel, keep the bike loaded, and then you use that load to then, with your feet and dropping your heel, push the bike ahead underneath you. And so it's a very quick squash and scooch. So I'll often tell people, like, imagine you've got a football underneath, a soccer ball for Americans, but a football underneath your foot. Then you just squash it, drop your heel, and scooch it away, and the ball should just sort of race ahead of you down the field.
Yeah.
Very much a low leg movement. It's sort of knee, dynamic kind of hip, knee, ankle movement. Nice strong movement from that lower leg.
Yeah, and it's explosive. It's an explosive movement. Your leg muscles are huge, right? Comparatively to your body, and you can really put a lot of energy into the pedals. And this process of squashing and scooching being connected, if you think about, for listeners here, like an arc, it's not an L, but an arc, that has it's a continuous movement. And that's going to initiate that wheel coming off the ground, which then leads to the next part of bending the knees, because your hips have come down because you scooched out. So you're using your knees then to bend and adjust while covering the brakes, covering the rear brake.
Yeah.
So that we can, if we're exploding too much, we've got our bailout for this.
Yeah.
But in this instance here, I think from the teaching perspective is really focusing in on how long is this old puddle manual going to be? And it might be to start off with one bike length.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're kind of training the rider towards, and really making it clear to them that that's what we're doing, as opposed to the BMX going to get ice cream manual.
Yeah.
Like, we need to start here. It's going to be a bike length at first.
Yeah.
And often you'll see that bike length and it'll progress. Longer.
Well, I think that's really cool, because this is really common in coaching for both students and coaches. Is like, if you set the goal too high, people will get, basically they'll just get kind of upset that they didn't achieve the goal, and so they'll withdraw and they'll disengage. So it's really important that you just set shorter distances to maintain and just keep the learning process positive. And it's a lot of that requires patience. So a lot of the time when you're looking at a skill that's technically quite simple, like a manual, squash and scooch, bend your knees, explode the bike ahead, it doesn't take long to teach somebody the technique of a manual, but it takes 1-2 years to do a really good manual. It can take a really long time. So it's really important to set goals that help build confidence, help build motivation. The best way to do that is be patient with yourself, be patient with the process. So you set smaller targets or closer targets to try and get to. People get annoyed. They see someone else, well, here, she can manual 4 bike lengths, I can only manual 2. Well, you're not her. Humans are different. Like, be kind to yourself, set yourself a proper goal that encourages you and doesn't disencourage you.
For sure. And I see this in teaching the manuals. You'll have situations where you're seeing success, 1, 2, 3 bike lengths, and then things fall apart.
Yeah.
And there's a regression, and it's important there again, for coaches to really focus in on that. Like, how can we help our riders be kind to themselves in situation? How can we have patience and knowing when to take a break from teaching the manual? Because you talked about it can be very exhausting, and sometimes just getting tired, impacts the movement. So if we do see that, maybe it's time to move on and do something else.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the podcast. If you want to learn more about us, please check out our first episode, which digs into who we are, what we do, and our background in coaching and mountain bike industry. You can also check us out on Instagram at Donuts and Bikes, or at our podcast, the Mountain Bike Coaching Podcast.buzzsprout.com. And now back to the show.
Yeah, and that sounds easy, but it's hard to do. And I only over like a long time have I started to learn to trust the quality, not quantity process. Like, it's hard to get someone to stop manualing after, say, 15 minutes because they got worse. Well, I've only been doing it for 15 minutes. Well, you're just getting worse. So stop. Stop. Because every time you practice and you're getting worse, all you're doing is reinforcing bad movements, bad biomechanics, bad outcomes. Practice has to be purposeful, and that requires patience, and it's hard to do because you want to learn to manual. So if one day you're doing really well, manual for half an hour, manual until you get exhausted. But if one day you're just like 10 minutes and then you start getting worse, just stop, go get a coffee, preferably with a donut, and go do something else. And that requires discipline, and it's difficult to do, but it's really important that they do that. One thing I was just looking at, like part 1, neutral poke buzz, really it's just a warm-up range of movement exercise. And then the squash and the scooch, that's kind of the explosive piece of the manual. So it's like the range of movement piece and almost the pressure control piece. If you just combine those two things together, a lot of the time you can get a mini manual or a puddle manual for 1 bike length, 2 bike lengths without anything else, really. It's just poke and buzz, squash and scooch. Obviously, when you're doing the manual, you're not buzzing your butt anymore. That's just a warm-up exercise to feel the range of movement. But as you poke the bike ahead, you're poking the bike ahead with that squash and the scooch. You're basically just adding the range of movement back into that squash and scooch. I'd say 90% of the time that can get people doing a basic manual. And then if they want to get close to that balance point, maybe keep the front wheel up for longer and start to feel that balance point. That's where the bending the knees, dropping the hips, and covering the brakes come in. Because if the knees are bent, you can then extend your legs and push the bike ahead, which can help lift the front wheel. And if you're covering the back brake and the front wheel gets a little high, you can just gently drag that back brake, and that will bring the front wheel down. And they're your two tools, basically, to find that equilibrium with your balance point between front wheel too low, I'm going to have to push with my legs, front wheel too high, I'm going to tap the rear brake. But if the knees are bent, that's where it gives you that ability to finesse that balance point. So I'd often say, like, the bend and cover is like, that's almost like part 3. That's the stuff you want to be thinking about when you're trying to actually maintain that balance point for a bit longer. But if you want to get started, range of movement, squash and scooch, nice and explosive, that will get most people started off the top of the bat, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I like to think about that. The knees are your, the knees and the brake are like your adjustment points.
Yeah.
The dials, so to speak. And therein is where the magic happens, for sure, but also it's the long, lengthy process.
Yeah. Can you talk quickly about, like, why does anyone want to learn to manual apart from looking cool? Because that's the obvious one. We all want to look cool. That's why we eat donuts. But why? Can you tell our listeners, like, why else do we want to learn how to manual? What are some practical or less practical applications of manuals? Because really they should. We know, hands down, everybody at some point should try and learn how to do a basic manual. Why should they?
The first thing I think of is riding down a single track and a hole, a depression, a roller, spaces between rocks. It's a way of being able to maintain your flow. And reduce any sort of negative input from the front end, so that you're able to flow and stay on the line that you want, is kind of the first place that I like to think about using that, or why it's applicable. Besides just looking cool and feeling really good, right? The rollers, potentially maintaining speed through a set of rollers. Another example.
That's a big one for me. Like, even as just a safety component to my riding, like if I'm riding jump trails that I'm less familiar with, the fact that I can manual is a tool that makes me safer on my bike, because I can absorb the tabletop and manual over the top and maintain my speed. If there's some doubles that I've never hit before, I can manual between the doubles if they're sort of more roller shaped and still keep my speed. sometimes I don't want to get in the air, and the manual is the perfect tool to deal with those rollers and things, but still maintain my speed and still being able to absorb some of those rollers. So it's, for me, a lot of the time, yeah, it's cool. It looks rad, and it's definitely a nice playful tool. But for me, it's also, as you get faster on the bike and you get to ride more rad terrain, it's definitely a risk management tool for sure. Like all skills. What about skills? How would you say it kind of translates to just general overall skills for riders?
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking there that, think back to the drops episode, when we teach drops, we're teaching skills. Same applies here. We're really looking at position again, and how the position impacts the outcome that we're trying to achieve on the bike here, getting the front wheel in the air. Pressure control, the squash and scooch. This is a pressure control. How well we connect those two movements, how intense it is, and then timing coordination. How we put all of these pieces together in the right order at the right time. So the once we're getting to the balance point, or trying to get to the balance point, the squash and scooch, the lowering the hips, the bending of the knees, the use of the brakes, all of these things are minute timing pieces. And I think that anytime that we're dealing with that with the rider, we're dealing with the finer points of these things. We're really helping train the rider to be more effective in everything that they do. To have a better sense of timing, for not just the manual, but for jumps, whatever, better instincts with pressure, and then a wider range of movement in their position. And then you mentioned braking. What's something that I definitely struggle with the manual is being able to really fall back into my brake.
Yeah. And
being able to really manipulate the brake the way that I want to. It's one of my goals this year, is really dial that piece of it in.
Yeah. So you mean not over brake and then slam the front wheel down, or obviously not under brake and then scare yourself?
Yeah. Because I usually will over brake and bring the wheel down too much. So just working on that really that sweet spot of where the contact point is for the brake bite, so I can, get it based on the speed and all that. So, but I think, that's again, another really very useful outcome in terms of skill with this.
And I think it's so important to realize, because people might get deflated, like, oh, my manuals suck. I've given up on manuals. And keep learning them. Don't worry, be proud of your rubbish manuals. Everybody has a rubbish trick. Be proud of it, own it, and keep working on it, because it's just going to keep developing, like you said, range of movement, pressure skills, timing, braking. I'll often say to people, hey, anyone want to get better at controlling their speed down steep rock rolls? And around here in Whistler, that's fairly common. And sweet, okay, let's learn some manuals. And then there'll be kind of this sort of weird look on their face. I'm like, what? But manuals teach you so much about brake finesse, which is what you were just saying. So now all I need to do on that steep terrain to control my speed is exactly the same concept, but just with my front brake now. Right. Where I've got that perfect balance between just enough braking to control my speed, but not too much braking that my front wheel locks, or not too little braking that I pick up too much speed. I have a real good sense over that dial of power on my front brake, and manuals can teach you so much about that. It's just on the other end of the bike, but it's the same concept.
Right. Something else that occurs to me, Paul, with this skill wise, it is how crucial some of our smaller movements are.
Yeah.
When you think about the manual and all of the joints that are having to move and then what impacts that movement has on the whole is pretty profound. For instance, the shoulders, are the shoulders shrugged forward, or the shoulders back? Has an overall impact on the manual. Ankles, Obviously the bigger knees and hips for sure, but those smaller pieces there, especially the shoulders, for me seem to be can be a breakthrough when working with people about chin up, shoulders back. And that opens up the body, and just that one movement is just another adjustment point that the rider can have then.
And that relates a lot to balancing as well. Like if you look at a little kid trying to balance, physiologically we develop fine motor movement from the core out, right? That's sort of basic physiology. And so you look at a little kid trying to balance, and they can kind of move their upper body or their lower body. and then gradually it's like the quadrants. And then as you get older and older in sort of teens into adults, you have that fine motor control. But it's that actually also regresses in adults or any rider when you take away their stability. So if you have a rider or an athlete and say sort of your classic kind of low intermediate rider, or even an advanced rider, and you suddenly take away their stability and they're not used to it, it's almost like they'll revert back to that child where their body movements now become, they're balancing with their upper body and their lower body. They're not balancing with fine movements from their wrists, their ankles, their knees. There's not a lot of separation. Like if they happen to move their hips, does it pull their shoulders that way, or can they move their hips and keep their shoulders where they want? And so that's what happens with manuals is we've taken that stability away, and now people it takes time, it takes mileage in that environment to regain that sense of separation and fine motor control with the smaller joints. Because you'll see it, you'll see them trying to learn to manual, and it looks quite boxy, it looks quite awkward, it doesn't look very efficient, and that's because of those things that we just touched on there. Does that make sense with you? Or?
Oh, totally. And it made me think through back to this idea of teaching to competence in one piece of this, which is like thinking about the puddle manual. Like we need to teach to a level of consistency in that one, right? Just the short manual before we even starting to think about all of these 5 points, right? And so we're building up success by focusing in on the specific movements, the squash and the scooch, right?
Yeah.
And the leading, the poking, and dialing those things in well before we move on to anything else. Because when we're learning anything new, we're typically thinking about it. Yeah. And in a lot of ways, our movements reflect that thinking about it. And we need to get autonomous movements of the squash and the scooch. Before we even start looking at the moving towards the balance point. And I think that's where, I've definitely made errors in the past of trying to move on too quickly, with people of like, well, let's make sure that we're able to do these things without thinking about them. Yeah. Before we get into being cool. Yeah. With the long manual.
Yeah. And that reminds me of something you and I discussed in previous years, like the paradoxical progression, where people might start off with part 1, like neutral, poke the bike ahead, bend your knees and buzz your butt on the rear tire. And then they'll go to part 2 where they add that explosive squash and scooch with the lower legs, the lower body. And they'll start doing a basic manual with that kind of range of movement and then that squash and scooch. And then they'll start to get worse because they're tired or they're overthinking, like you said, and it's not autonomous yet. And a lot of the time, the coach's role in that point is, well, let's go back a step. So that what we mean by paradoxical progression is actually going down a step is actually getting you closer to your end target. So it's like a step back to take a step forward, essentially. But students, like on their own, they won't necessarily do that because they'll kind of do part 1 and then they'll move to part 2. So in their mind, well, I've done part 1, I don't need to go back. But good learning is, I actually did it with my daughter the other day on the piano. She was practicing piano, and she sat down and she started playing both hands straight away, and she was getting frustrated. And I was like, sweetie, just stop, just warm up. Like, take a few minutes to play the left hand on its own, play the right hand on its own, and then put them together. And she's like, oh, but I've done that already. I'm like, yeah, but you're just warming up and you haven't mastered both hands together yet. So you should still always practice both hands separately. And it's the same here for manuals. Like, until you've mastered the manual, at any point in your learning, you can totally just practice the separate pieces together because you haven't mastered the manual. Otherwise, like, you would have figured out how to put them together. So the fact that you haven't figured that out yet suggests that you can just practice part A or part B or part C independently.
I wonder how many people have truly mastered the manual. You know, like, can hold a manual indefinitely. Because it seems like for me, it ebbs and flows. Like, there are times when, you know, I feel pretty competent at it, and then other times it's like, oh, what the heck?
I'm way better at it when no one else is around. the best manuals I've ever done, no one has ever seen. Like, the last really good manual I did, I swear the front wheel up was up for, I want to say 30 seconds. It was this long road, and I basically rode down the road in a manual. It's probably one of the best manuals I've ever done. And nobody was there. I didn't have a GoPro. Yeah, especially in today's world of Instagram and Reels. I was doing a staff training session on Whistler the other day. Slight side story, and we're riding down Grey Zone. It's like this nice little power run, and this instructor that I was training, he stopped halfway down, and he was like, hey dude. And I was like, well, what's going on? Why has he stopped? It's like a bluebird day and it's this sweet power run. Like what the hell? And he's like, yeah, can you take a picture of me? And I was like, did you just stop halfway down a power run? And did you make me stop halfway down a power run just to take a picture of you? I was like, oh my God, either I'm getting old or like something's going wrong in the world. I didn't know what to do. I cried a little bit that day. I was like, holy shit, in 20 years of coaching snowboarding, I've never had anyone stop halfway down a power run to say, hey man, can you take a picture? Holy shit. Anyways, sidebar there, but
all right. So
anyway, manuals. What are we talking about? Manuals.
Have you ever had the manual dream?
Oh yeah.
Occasionally I'll have the manual dream and actually kind of wake up in the dream and like be conscious that I'm dreaming, and like, oh, I can take my left hand off and drag it on the pavement and I'm still going. You wake up, you're just like,
why is it so easy in the dream? And I can't do it in real life.
Yeah. Well, cool. Should we wrap this up, Paul?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Go do manuals. They're wicked.
That's the end. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, don't give up. Anyone can learn. Just look after, if you're a bit older like me, just make sure you're sensible with your back and your hips and your neck and your shoulders. But otherwise, get to it. Have fun. Go play on the bike.
Yeah, I think that's, just to wrap up this idea of the two different manuals here and setting expectations of, if that a manual can be a couple bike links.
Yeah.
It's the initiation of getting that wheel off the ground. It's not riding down the road indefinitely.
Yeah.
Necessarily. And so, I think that it's something that all mountain bikers should strive to learn for sure. And that it can be, like you said, learn pretty quickly in the right conditions. And back to the challenge, it'd be fun to see if anybody that hasn't tried this before can learn the manual, the puddle manual from a podcast.
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah, I'd be interested. I mean, if anyone wants to send us a video or something, or send us a message on Instagram, that would be cool.
Sweet.
Really cool. I guess we need to talk about donuts, don't we?
We do. I did some homework
Oh, good.
I had to feel like I had to make up. So yeah, I had a little trip off the mountain to go ride the other day and went to a donut shop that I hadn't been to in a while. Like literally a little hole in the wall in the middle of nowhere, off the mountain. And
was it just some old lady's house, or
kind of?
Or was it an actual shop?
It's a shop. It's just a little one-off shop at a crossroads. In Wilkes County, just off the mountain here, and they typically we'd go down the ride and we'd stop and get basic donuts. And I walked in expecting maybe 3 donuts to choose from, and their case, I couldn't make a decision. There were so many choices. I mean, like
what's the name of this place?
It's called Dixie Donuts in Wilkesboro, just about 30 miles off the mountain from here, and near the Warrior Creek trails. And they had ended up getting a key lime cream filled donut that had like the graham cracker crust, like the crust you get in a good pie. Yeah. Like a triangle placed in the top of the key lime. So there's a huge donut, key lime, whipped cream, graham cracker. And I'm like, I need to take a picture of this for Instagram. And man, I almost dropped the donut. I was going to be like, I was like, this would, I still would have eaten it, I think, but it was amazing. Yeah. It made me very happy, which, as we know, makes people healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw a good thing today. Like, I think I put it on Instagram, and the guy was like, what did he say? He's like, people say that you got to eat healthy. And it's like, well, I am eating a donut, and eating's healthy. It's like, perfect. This is a man after my own heart. I have one little thing I could share. Like the other day we had this isn't technically a donut, but it's quite funny. I think I had a slice of cherry. I keep saying cherry pie, blueberry pie. The last 2 weeks, I keep calling this pie in the fridge cherry pie, and it's blueberry pie. I don't know why. And we had a slice left, and I thought, what can I do with a slice for a family of 4? Because everyone's going to argue that they didn't get a piece of blueberry pie.
Right.
So I put it in the blender with some ice cream and milk, and I made a cherry pie milkshake.
What?
Yeah.
You put it in a blender?
Yeah. That's pretty good. It was cherry pie, ice cream, and a splash of orange juice. Dude, seriously.
What did everybody think about it?
Pretty pumped. Yeah, good. Everyone was pumped. I don't know if Shannon was that keen on it, but the kids and I enjoyed it. So, yeah, if you're a family and you're all fighting over the last piece of cherry pie, that's your solution. Blend it up. Turn it into a milkshake. Wow.
That's
how we roll in this house.
That's a great story.
Eat healthy, kids.
Cool.
All right. Cool. Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of Donuts and Bikes. We hope this conversation elevated your understanding of manuals from a rider's or a coach's perspective. We like to think that riding bikes isn't rocket science. It's just bike science. So get out there, ride smart, and don't forget, eat a donut when you're done.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show and that it sparked some ideas for your riding and your coaching. As always, our approach to coaching is on pros and cons, not rights and wrongs. And with that in mind, our podcast is meant to be more of a conversation about topics and techniques rather than a final say in how to ride or how to teach. As always, please take care if using or applying any of the techniques discussed in this podcast. Stay safe, ride smart, and we'll see you next time.
With ice cream, that's awesome.
Well, it's just one slice, so I was like, yeah, what else are we going to do here?